So I'm a rabbi in a shul that has actually 3 rabbis. So I don't know, and it works really well. So I don't know whether that's good or not. So your case there.
No stop.
But I think it's important. What maybe you're really getting at is that there's one final way of making decisions, as opposed to necessarily one person making decisions, which may be an important one. But anyway, okay, so I want to talk about a little bit about Halakhic Discourse, how we do it, or how people are doing it, whether they admit it or not, or what they're really getting at when they're doing it. There's a lot of this going on over the last few weeks, for sure. The moratorium is over, right? So we could talk about that. And then we sort of have a new round of that going around the internet, I guess starting this morning or last night over Yotzot, on cross currents, and that sort of stuff. I'm sure certain people will be chiming in online soon about that. I won't mention you. Okay, so what I'd like to do is sort of not discuss halacha at all today, at least not directly. What I'd like to do is look at a whole bunch of different concepts in Western legal philosophy. I'm sorry, it's a little highbrow for a Sunday morning, but so be it. That's how I roll. I'd like to look at a few concepts in Western legal philosophy about how law works, how legal argumentation works, what law is made up of and what it's doing. When we talk about law, and this would apply to halacha as well, but again, I'm going to try to avoid very direct references to halacha. And we can sort of use that as a framework for understanding or thinking about what's going on in a lot of the discussions that either we take part in or we are sort of outside observers of, but it can help us make sense of what is actually going on in a way that oftentimes, unfortunately, the participants in those discussions don't really appreciate what they're doing. Just as sort of a preface to this, the first source on the sheet is a quote from Rabbi Dr. Isidore Tversky, which kind of justifies what I'm about to do, because I think it does need some justification. I'm sort of going to be taking all of these Western legal philosophy categories and kind of superimposing them on halacha, or asking you in your own mind to superimpose them on halacha. I'm not going to do that explicitly. But Rabbi Tversky writes that when you know your way, your point of departure and goals, then use philosophy, science, and the humanities to illumine your exposition, sharpen your categories, probe the profundities and subtleties of the Masorah, and reveal its charm and majesty. In doing so, you should be able to command the respect from the alienated, and communicate with some who might otherwise be hostile or indifferent to your teachings, as well as to increase the sensitivity and spirituality of the committed. Of course, this is something that anyone who identifies in any way as modern Orthodox or as probably observant Jewish in the last 200 years grapples with, sort of how much do we allow what we take in from the outside world knowledge and ways of thinking about knowledge and the world and ideas and morality and ethics and categories to influence the ways we think about Torah and halacha. On the one hand, we can try to avoid them entirely. On the other hand, we can sort of just arbitrarily take, let's say, non-natively Jewish or non-natively Torah concepts or ideas and sort of put Torah in those boxes, put halachic concepts and Torah concepts in those boxes and make them fit, which doesn't always work well. Rabbi Tversky has an approach where he sort of expresses in something he's sort of lived in his own academic and rabbinic life, where he emphasizes the necessity of really, really understanding what you're doing when you're doing Torah. But once you understand what you're doing, it's great to sort of look at other thought systems and other ways of conceptualizing what it is that you're doing in order to have a better framework for putting all of the pieces into. I know this has worked for me in the past, certainly in halacha, and hopefully I think this framework is illuminating, if not absolutely perfect. So I'd like to focus on sort of 3 overlapping ways of thinking about law, 3 overlapping conceptual frameworks for what law consists of, and we can think of halacha in a similar way. So the first one is an idea taken from H.L.A. Hart, who was a very, very prominent legal philosopher in England in the mid-1900s through 60s and 70s. And he argued that law, any system of law, any normative system really, is a union of primary and secondary rules. And what he means by that is as follows. Primary rules, in source number 3, primary rules are norms and directives that directly regulate behavior. Okay, so all the things that tell you to do something or don't do something. Stop at a stop sign, right? Drive on the right side of the road, file your tax return before April 15th, do not kill, put on tefillin every day, do not light a fire on Shabbos. These are commands, these are rules, these are norms, whatever sort of rule they happen to be, but they directly regulate your behavior. They tell you to do something or to not do something, or that, even if they're not quite so clear, you should do something or you shouldn't do something. He notes that primary rules, and we can appreciate this intuitively, this is why this kind of stuff kind of works. Primary rules suffer from 3 main problems. When you have a system that only consists of primary rules, and we can sort of think about it, if halacha consisted only of rules that tell me to do things and not do things, and that was the only thing in the system, it would suffer from 3 major problems. Problem number 1 is uncertainty. How do I know when someone says women cannot be rabbis, how do I know that that rule is actually a rule in the system? Maybe that rule is just being popped out of thin air or made up by someone based on some preconceived notions. So we wouldn't accuse anyone of doing that, but or saying that the rule is that women can be rabbis. I don't want to sort of box myself into one side of the equation or the other. We can play this to both sides of the equation. It doesn't matter what the rule happens to be. How do we know that that rule is genuinely a legal rule within the law system, or a halachic rule that's genuinely halacha, as opposed to whatever I came up with while flipping a coin? The rules don't tell us this, because the rules are just do this and don't do that. And I have no way of knowing when the rule says do this or don't do that, that it's actually a rule that I'm supposed to be following. Maybe someone made it up and stuck it in there, right? Animal Farm, everyone read Animal Farm. Talk Lord of the Flies, so we can get back into all of our high school reading now, right? Animal Farm, right? The animals wake up periodically, and suddenly there are new rules written on the board above the barn, right? How do you know that any of those new rules are legit rules within the system? They're on the board. Maybe that makes them legit. Maybe something else is needed in order to make them legitimate rules. You don't know. Yeah.
That also applies to, like someone tells you this is usher, and it's just that they're, it's not what this far in Ashkenaz, they tell you it's usher.
Sure, so the point is, right, so how do you know, right, so the statement, this is usher,
rules for you.
This is usher is a primary rule, okay? It's an expression of a primary rule. You ask me, can I do this? And I say, no, you cannot do that. That's an expression of a primary rule. I'm trying to directly regulate your conduct. But how do you know that what I'm telling you is actually a rule that you're supposed to follow? There needs to be something else to tell you when you're supposed to follow. Are you supposed to follow me, or are you supposed to follow somebody else? They're trying to tell you something different. How do you know which rule is actually a rule? Additionally, primary rules are static. All you have is a system of do's and don'ts, and you have no way of adapting or changing or altering or repealing or making new rules as conditions change. Okay, we can intuitively appreciate this. Life changes, society changes. Once upon a time, lending on interest was a very, very, very bad thing to do for very good reasons, and God prohibits it. And then, hundreds of years later, the rabbis realized that not lending on interest is a really, 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 really bad, not good thing to do, and we have to permit this somehow. And they need to adjust and tweak the rule and make a new rule and create a mechanism that enables functionally a real change in the rule on prohibitions on lending on interest. What makes if there's only a system of do's and don'ts, there's no way to do that. Okay, society changed, the economy changed. We're in a commerce economy. We need capital. We need to aggregate capital. We need credit. But so sorry, we can't change the rule. The rule is what it is, and we can't do anything about it. What do we do now? Additionally, primary rules have this third problem of inefficiency. Lo and behold, we all disagree about what the rules mean and what they require in practice. Okay, we take the rule, do not light a fire on Shabbos, and we can have endless flame wars in the group about whether this applies to light and kosher switches and radios and. Huh? Wow, I totally didn't even realize that. Awesome.
What?
No, totally didn't realize that now.
Flame wars on Shabbos in
that.
regards to lighting fire.
And you have flame wars.
It's okay, doesn't matter. Okay, so we can disagree endlessly about what that rule entails. We have a primary rule, do not light fires on Shabbos, and we can disagree about what that rule entails, who gets to decide what the rule entails, how should we punish people who break the rule, who should punish people who break the rule. This also is not resolved by primary rules, because again, primary rules are just rules that say do this or don't do that. Doesn't help us figure out, how do we figure out what the rule means? Who gets to decide what the rule means? We disagree about what the rule means, so what do? We just disagree forever about it? It's inefficient, it doesn't work, the system doesn't function well. So because of these three problems, Hart suggested that legal systems include both primary rules, rules that tell you do's and don'ts, and also secondary rules. Secondary rules, in source number 5, secondary rules are rules about rules. I'm not using the word meta rules, we're going to use that word later. But rules about rules, okay? They determine which rules are actually law, how rules are made, changed, repealed, and how they can be legitimately interpreted, applied, enforced, and by whom. Okay? And there are three types of secondary rules. He says there's rules of recognition. Rules of recognition solve the uncertainty problem. A rule of recognition tells you which rules are rules and which rules are not rules. For example, in source number 6, I have examples, right? We could say that in the United States of America, we have a rule of recognition that says laws found in the United States Code or in the Constitution are rules. Rules found on the back of the Cracker Jack box are not rules. These are not rules within the United States system, although they may tell you to do something or not do something, you don't have to listen to it. Because the rule says, the rule of recognition, the secondary rule says, you only have to recognize as normative, as binding, those rules that show up in a particular place. In this book, in this text, carved into this stone, whatever it happens to be. Of course, these get complicated, right? So it's easy to say rules, Torah rules, rules written in the scroll. Those are rules of the system. What do those rules mean? That's a separate problem, right? That's the inefficiency problem. What about minhag? Minhag is complicated, okay? So how do we decide what minhagim are rules and what minhagim are not rules? We have to have more rules of recognition. A good rule of recognition in a complex system is going to be hugely complex, okay? But in theory, at least, we can think about a rule that encapsulates all the things that you need to look at in order to determine whether a statement, do this, don't do that, is legitimate or not. Whether it's something that you have to listen to or not. Additionally, we have what's called rules of change. Rules of change empower an individual or a body or of persons to introduce new primary rules, or change existing primary rules. Such as, right, so we could have rules that say, right, we have rules in the Constitution. Those rules are rules because we have a rule of recognition that says rules in the Constitution are legitimate rules, and we have a rule of change in the Constitution that says the law of the United States or the federal government, laws of the federal government can be changed by a majority vote of Congress. It's both houses of Congress, signed by the President, etc., etc. Right? This is a rule of change. It identifies how rules can be repealed, how they can be altered, how new ones can be made under changing circumstances so that we can adapt the legal system, the primary rules of the system, to new situations. Likewise, we have this with courts and other things. We recognize certain courts have authority to make new rules or change old rules, etc., etc. And the same with, then we have rules of adjudication, rules that determine how we know or how we decide what the rules mean. We all disagree about what the rules mean. How do we determine that? Well, in the United States, we go to courts. The courts get to decide what rules mean. Depending on what kind of rules you're dealing with, you go to different courts, and the courts can kick things up the chain. You can appeal things higher and higher, and eventually there's a court all the way on top that you can't appeal further from, and just can't avoid the cameo.
It's like, I'm like Stan Lee.
And these rules of adjudication, and the rules of adjudication tell us how you decide how the court cases proceed. Every side has to have a lawyer, and they have to have an opportunity to present evidence and their arguments, etc., etc. And eventually the judge will decide, or a jury will decide. And these rules kind of determine how they set a procedure for how we determine what rules mean and how we should punish violations of rules, how we determine when a violation of a rule has taken place, etc., etc. Okay? All systems, Hart says, have these primary rules and secondary rules, and the two of them together is what makes the system work. Okay? I'm not going to state it explicitly, but if you're thinking, as we discuss it, you can sort of start thinking about how this works in Halakha. We have primary rules in Halakha, and we also have secondary rules in Halakha, and we have all three kinds of secondary rules as well. We have rules of recognition that we use to determine when a rule is a rule, right? We have rules that say, rules in the Talmud are rules, and then we have rules that say that rules in the Shulchan Aruch are rules except when they're not, and we have rules for, not joking. And then we have rules that say that different books for different groups of people, different groups, halachic traditions recognize different books or different authorities as valid rule staters in that tradition, etc., etc. And we have rules of change. There are ways that halacha can change. Sometimes that's stated explicitly. Some hedrons can make zeros and takanos, and post-Talmudic authorities can do other things to change rules, and sometimes it's hard to describe how they're changing exactly. But there's ways to change, and there are ways that we can discourse and sort of evaluate and argue over whether a particular change has satisfied the conditions of the rules of change. There are proper ways to change rules. Is this change legitimate, or is this change not legitimate? Is this change satisfying the rules of change, or is this a violation of the rules of change? And we're all familiar with such arguments, especially in recent years. Okay, and we also have rules of adjudication, also, which we argue endlessly about, but it doesn't change the fact that they exist. There are rules, there are ideas about who gets to decide what the rules mean and what they are, and how they're supposed to decide what they mean. Are they supposed to decide what they mean based on online petitions? Are they supposed to decide what they mean based on sitting in a base measures completely divorced from communities, just to play both sides of the spectrum over there, right? Completely different senses of how to adjudicate and best determine, legitimately determine what a rule means and how it applies. But the rules are there, and those are different than the rules that say do and don't. These are rules about how to know what the primary rules are. Okay. Overlapping with that, we have a completely different theory of how law works by Ronald Dworkin, Olav Shalom, who taught here in NYU for many, many years. And Ronald Dworkin and H.L.A. Hart had this running disagreement for decades over their two different conceptions of how law works. Like most good arguments, they really don't have to be arguing with each other. They're just focusing on different things. They can actually work together. So I'm going to look at Dworkin also now and sort of think about his idea of what law consists of. And we can, again, start to plug those concepts into halacha and see that these concepts exist in halacha as well. And when we think about halachic arguments, we can start identifying what people are referring to and what they're arguing about, whether they themselves recognize this or not. I've had long discussions with Rabbi Ozer Glickman at YU, although he disagrees with me on some things. We've had long discussions and bemoaning the fact that, in general, poskim nowadays, or poskim generally, really, don't think systematically about what they're doing when they're doing it. They don't have a good sense of what sorts of arguments they're making while they're making them, and what kinds of things they're pulling on, what kinds of rules they're discussing, and that's unfortunate because it makes the argumentation much more muddled and it causes a lot more disagreement than perhaps is necessary. Okay, or maybe not disagreement, but certainly a lot more delegitimization of alternative opinions. Okay, so Ronald Dworkin has this different idea. Hart says that law is made up of rules and secondary and primary rules. Hart says that law is not made up of primary rules and secondary rules. Hart says you can explain law by as a system of rules and principles. It's a combination of rules and principles working together. Okay, rules we can sort of intuit. Rules are applicable in source number 8. Rules are applicable in all or nothing fashion. if the facts of a rule are if the facts a rule stipulates are given, then either the rule is valid, in which case the answer it supplies must be accepted, or the rule is not valid, in which case it contributes nothing to the decision. Okay? Meaning, you may have a rule that says it is prohibited to light a fire on Shabbos. Okay? If that is a rule, if that's genuinely a rule, a legitimate rule, and again, Dworkin doesn't discuss this, you sort of have to go to Hart and start talking about, is this a legitimate rule? But if this is a legitimate rule, then you start to say, is today Shabbos? Yes or no? Is this a fire? Yes or no? Or maybe, but it gets complicated, of course, but you have to answer the question somehow. Am I lighting it? Yes or no? Depending on your answer to those questions, if the facts stipulated by the rule are there, then the rule operates. If the answer to any of those questions is no, then the rule is simply not operating, right? It is prohibited to light a fire on Shabbos, sure, but today's not Shabbos, or I'm not lighting a fire, or the fire is being lit, but not by me. The rule doesn't affect the situation, okay? But once the rule kicks in, it applies. You can't say, if the rule says lighting a fire on Shabbos is prohibited, and it is Shabbos, and it is a fire, and I am lighting it, you can't then say, but I didn't mean it. Because meaning it was not part of that rule, okay? Of course, the real rule is more complex than that, right? Where I'm just using a sort of a very simplistic example, right? The real rule is infinitely more complex. You have to have intent, and there are all sorts of extenuating factors that come into play that may permit a violation of that rule in particular. But if we formulate the rule simply, you cannot light a fire on Shabbos, then bringing in extraneous considerations into the rule just doesn't matter. You can feel as bad as you want about having lit the fire, or you can have not meant it as much as you want, or you could have done it for a really, 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 really good reason, but that reason is not part of the rule, so the rule operates. You're in violation. All or nothing fashion, black and white. Those are rules. Okay? And so, and Dworkin himself gives examples, right? 3 strikes and you're out. Okay? If the batter tries really, really hard, he's still out after 3 strikes. It doesn't matter how hard he tried, and it doesn't matter if it's the last out of the game and it's the World Series and it's so close, and how stupid, because, come on, like, the game's over now, like, this is boring, right? Or this shouldn't have happened, or whatever. There are endless reasons to say that the rule shouldn't apply, but if the facts stipulated in the rule applied, there were 3 strikes, we're out.
Where's the umpire got the call from?
Huh?
Where's the umpire got the call from?
Well, okay, so that just complicates the rule, but that's part of the rule, right? I don't know anything about sports, so I can't really speak to that. Okay, likewise, just to use sort of an American legal example, right? A will is only valid if signed by 3 witnesses. Okay, I'm on my deathbed, I'm writing my will, and I only get 2 witnesses. 2 witnesses is pretty good, but I'm so sorry, the rule is just not, the will is just not valid because it violated the rule. It wasn't consistent with the rule. The rule doesn't help you. There's nothing we can do about it. You're dead now, and Uncle Sam is now going to take all of your money because you didn't manage to dispose of it by will, and your estate's going to have to go through probate and all these other terrible things, simply because you used 2 witnesses instead of 3 witnesses. We're pretty sure that you wrote that will and you were of sound mind, because 2 witnesses testified to it. I'm so sorry, there's a rule in place, and rules apply in an all or nothing fashion. You didn't have 3 witnesses, no will. Okay? Likewise, we can, yeah.
And so, is there any disagreement between the 2 approaches so far? I don't hear any place where they disagree really.
Which? Hart and Dworkin?
Dworkin and Hart.
So they disagree only because Dworkin thinks that Hart thinks that there's no that there are no principles in law, and which is not true.
Aren't secondary rules principles?
No, Hart uses the word rules, and Dworkin kind of hinges on that, which is silly. And then there's another part of the argument that I'm not getting into about sort of the indeterminacy of the rules. Hart says that when you end up with a system of rules, there's a lot of vagueness there, and decision makers have to use discretion in the vagueness areas. And Dworkin doesn't think such vagueness exists because principles are there. And when you have principles, that fills in all the gaps. Okay? But about this, they don't necessarily disagree. Okay. In addition to, yeah, sorry.
Briefly ask, sorry. Is this distinction not also true between din and klal? Like, does that not already exist in halacha?
Maybe.
I mean,
between
then
rules and
essentially
principles?
is rules, yeah, and klalim are principles.
Maybe klalim could be general rules as opposed to local rules. Okay, so hamotzi mechaveru olav harai is a rule. It applies to a lot of different things. It's a klal gadol, but it's still a rule. There are local things that are principles also, as we'll see. Right, so we can come up with very localized concepts that apply only to one area of halacha, but the nature of the thing is a rule, not a principle. So principles are very different from rules. You can't have a system of just rules because we can imagine how the system goes if you just have rules, right? You light the fire on Shabbos and you feel terrible or you did it to save someone's life, but the rule wasn't formulated just right to cover you, so you're stuck. So sad. Right? So you also have to have principles. Principles don't set out legal consequences that follow automatically when conditions are met. Principles have a dimension of weight or importance. They state reasons that argue in one direction or the other, but do not necessarily necessitate a particular conclusion. Okay? We can think of lots of different kinds of principles. In American law, we have a principle: no man may profit from his own wrong. Okay? So if you murder your uncle, you can't inherit his estate. Okay? That's not a rule. There's no such rule. He left you. You're the sole. It's not only there. Okay. No, but right. He wrote you into his will, and he signed his will with 3 witnesses. But you killed him. So you can't. So sorry, right? That's not going to work. And what if you ran him over by accident during a dark, rainy night? Well, you were wrong. Maybe you were driving a little bit recklessly. Should you inherit or should you not inherit? Well, no man may profit from his own wrong is not a rule. It's a principle. It's fuzzy. It has a weight. You have to start weighing it. Well, what does it really mean? Should we apply this to a situation where someone killed someone else negligently? He didn't murder his uncle. He didn't want to kill his uncle. He was very happy to wait for his uncle to die in 20 years from now, and then he would inherit. It was an accident, but he did something wrong. Should we really apply this principle to deny him his inheritance simply because he was driving a bit dangerously? Or should we say, clearly this is not the sort of situation that the principle intends to deal with. It tends to prevent nephews from killing their uncles to get their money. It does not intend to prevent nephews from driving a few miles over the speed limit in the rain. Right? That's not what it's there for. So there's an element of weight here. You have to look at the facts and see sort of how the rationale for the principle plays out in a particular set of facts. Additionally, the nature of principles is, and this is true of rules, but even more so principles argue in different directions. You can have multiple principles in the same legal system that pull you in different directions at the same time. We can talk about, in halacha, we can talk about principles like misora, which is arguably possibly a principle, depending on how you use it, but the value of continuity, or those who want to change something need to prove or mount a persuasive argument for the change, pulls in maybe one direction, and kavanah brios maybe pulls in a different direction. Or there are all sorts of things that we can think of. Yeah?
Would minhag maybe be a stronger analogy than Masorah in this case?
Sure. Yeah, that's fine. Minhag is fine. Minhag is another principle. Or the notion that we should follow minhag absent good reasons to the contrary. It's a principle. It's a fairly widely accepted principle, except by some people who might have gotten banned from the group some time ago. I didn't say that. Okay, and you have example, right?
Or left in a fit of pique.
Okay, so we have rules and principles. Again, you can plug these into halakha, and you can think about how these kind of play out in halakhic arguments that we see all the time, especially online. People are arguing about how rules apply. Other people are arguing from principles. Oftentimes, they're talking past each other because they're talking about 2 different things. And oftentimes, even when they're not talking about 2 different things, they're not conscious of what they're doing, right? If you think about principles as something that has weight and as something that has persuasiveness, but persuasiveness that can cut both ways, it's not applicable in an all or nothing fashion. It doesn't automatically apply a certain way. Its principles, by their nature, entail the use of discretion and judgment. Judgment tends to lead to different opinions. by definition, that usually means that not all of those opinions except for one are completely beyond the pale, usually. Okay, one other thing I'd like to point, well, no, not one other thing, I shouldn't say that. Akiva went over, so I'm going to go over it. We can look at another, these are ways, these last two things were sort of ways of thinking about halacha and how halacha works and how the pieces in the system sort of work and function and what they are doing at any given moment. We can also think of three different ways, I think, of mounting halakhic arguments, or three different ways in which halakhic discourse manifests itself. We can talk about micro, macro, and meta halakhic argumentation, or halakhic claims. So micro-legal arguments, we see these all the time. Claims that address a specific legal problem and answer a specific local legal question. Okay? Can I eat this piece of meat? Is this, I'm sorry, let me correct that. Is this piece of meat, is this piece of meat kosher? Okay? Is this piece of meat kosher? This is a micro question. Answering, yes, this piece of meat is kosher. It was shefted according to the first several simanim in Yeridea, and it has not had contact with milk, and it was properly salted, etc., etc. Everything about this piece of meat is kosher, is a micro-legal comment, or is a micro-legal conclusion. However, in addition to micro-legal arguments, we can talk about macro-legal arguments. Yes, this piece of meat is kosher, but you should not eat it because it was factory farmed, or something like that. Okay, this animal was treated terribly. This is not an argument that the piece of meat is not kosher. This is not a micro-legal argument about the kosher status of the piece of meat. That's a very local issue about this piece of meat that looks at one area of Jewish law. But we can talk about the permissibility or impermissibility or any other legal halakhic aspect of the piece of meat from a variety of other perspectives as well, one of which would be its ethical status as something that was produced and that you're eating not as a result of what may be or may not be tzar b'alei. But there's a discussion there, but that's a macro-legal discussion. I call it a macro-legal discussion because it's generally applicable to endless other issues. Can I wear this shirt? Well, it's not shatnez, but it was produced by little kids in India making 3 cents a year. Should I wear the shirt? I don't know. But there are two different planes of halakhic argumentation on the issue going on there. One is a micro-argument, the other is a macro-argument. In addition to these two kinds of arguments, yeah.
So are you saying that there are different halachos that are different, are micro and they're micro halachos and different halachos that are macro? That they're like tzar b'alei is a macro halacha and that it applies to numerous different both of them? Or are you saying that there are different types of questions?
I'm saying that there are different types of questions. Most halakhic issues can be either micro or macro depending on the situation. Can I kick my cat? Right? Don't kick your cat. Cats are... Huh?
Sorry.
Don't kick your cat, okay? But if I'm asking the question, can I kick my cat? Does it violate the rules of tzar b'alei to kick my cat? I'm asking a micro-legal question. And I'm giving a micro-legal answer because this is a local issue, specifically to this particular issue. And if we debate the question, which we shouldn't, but if we were to debate it, we would be debating a micro-legal question and making micro-legal claims about the correct interpretation of what constitutes tzar b'alei and what does not. Yeah.
So you gave an example of a micro question being like, is this piece of meat kosher? Would the question, is turkey kosher, be a micro or a macro? Still micro.
So that is both. So let's move away from the question and think. No. We'll stay on the question. But instead of framing it in terms of is the question a micro or a macro question, we can think of how the argument about the response would go. The argument about the response can be micro, macro, or meta, which we haven't gotten to yet. But we can start talking about does this bird, is this bird carnivorous or well, okay, that's sort of, right? It raises all sorts of uncertainty problems, right? How do we answer these questions? But if we can ask local questions, I can make local arguments about the kosher status of a turkey. Turkeys are kosher because they are a domesticated, non-carnivorous, non-scavenger bird. Okay? Alternatively, you'll turn around to me and you'll say, what are you talking about? It has no misora. Okay? And that in part, no. But, and in part, that's a micro issue, right? So first, maybe you have to have misora. At the same time, that same argument is partaking of a broader macro issue, which is really a meta issue, which is how misora on animals works and how these things change over time and things like that.
So in your example about the piece of meat, you said the micro issue is the meat kosher, and the macro issue is how is the animal treated or how the work is treated. But if I, instead of asking, is the piece of meat kosher, if I asked, is the piece of meat, was it produced ethically, would then the fact that it's not kosher be the macro issue and the conditions be the micro issue?
If all one cares about, well, again, so this is why I'm trying to reframe it, refocus this away from the questions we're asking to the way in which we're answering the question. Can I eat this piece of meat? I can answer that question using a whole variety of different arguments. Okay, and if we're going to argue over the question, we're both going to be deploying all different kinds of arguments to support our position. One of my arguments is going to be, if I'm arguing that you can eat this piece of meat, one of the arguments that I deploy is going to be, well, it was shafted properly, it was salt, it hasn't had contact with, it's from a kosher animal, it hasn't had contact with milk, etc., so it's kosher. So yes, you can eat it. And don't tell me about Sar Balei Chaim and ethics, because sure, maybe that's an issue. Well, I can approach that two different ways. I might say, that's not an issue. We're talking about kosher here. If you want to ask me about Musar questions, go to a Musar person. I'm a halakhist. I'm going to tell you whether it's kosher or not. That's one approach. And then I'm sort of consciously limiting myself to the micro-legal claim. I'm only concerned with the micro issues. I don't think that the broader issues come into play here. You're asking me if it's kosher. That's not really what you asked me, right? You asked me if you can eat it, but I'm refocusing your question. I'm changing your question because I don't want to think in macro terms or meta terms about halacha. There are people who do this. Many people who do this. Alternatively, I could answer, yes, well, these issues matter because we want to know whether we can eat this piece of meat. In the totality of our religion, I want to know whether I can eat this piece of meat or should eat this piece of meat. And then I might say, well, you know, factory farming, it's kind of bad, and the animals are not treated very nicely. And you shouldn't eat it. Or I might say, it's kind of bad and they're not treated very nicely, but what else are we going to do? We live in an industrial society. This is just how these things are. I'm not going to tell you not to eat the piece of meat, or even that you shouldn't eat the piece of meat because of that. But you can choose not to.
But you could also answer the ethical question in a micro fashion. You can say, you know, was this animal, did it have more than 4 feet to walk around? Did it, I don't...
Well, this is a trephus issue. This is a micro issue on the conscience of the animal itself.
Okay, but even...
She's saying flip it. So
even the ethical questions, even the ethical questions
Sure.
is a micro way to answer those questions.
Oh, of course, right? So, let's say
that you're talking about it.
The fact that it's not local to this issue, it's a much broader question. I can apply the ethics, I can apply the ethical issue to whether I can wear a shirt, a particular shirt that's made in some country in a certain way, or I can ask it about whether, and that's not necessarily a Chaim issue in particular, right? So when you start discussing many macro issues, or you start making many kinds of macro arguments, some people are going to make those macro arguments in very broad brushstrokes. Ethics, whatever it is. Some people will start to say, no, let's look at Sar Balei Chaim. And now we're going to take a microscope to Sar Balei Chaim and analyze Sar Balei Chaim in order to figure out whether there's a real violation of Sar Balei Chaim here, or there's just something fuzzier going on that you're uncomfortable with. That's turning that's analyzing the macro issue in a micro way. But it doesn't change the fact that what we're talking about now is not the kashrus of the piece of meat, the local question about this piece of meat per se. We're asking a more global question about the ethics or the appropriateness of factory farming. We're talking about tzar b'alei, a broadly applicable halacha that can be applied all different places. And what I answer over here should probably impact how I answer other kinds of questions as well that implicate that issue.
Okay, so, sorry, one more question.
Yes.
Can you also then have the other way around, the macro question of, on the kashrus side of like, okay, an animal that you kill in this fashion is not considered shechita, and then that could be applied to other killing of animals.
Other killing, well, yeah, but that's still kashrus maybe.
So
Right?
there are no macro concerns in kashrus, there are only macro concerns in ethics.
By its nature, I would say kashrus is not a macro concern. It only applies to the status of my food that I'm going to put in my mouth. There are other things that are like that also, but there are many areas of halacha that are inherently broader. There are rule halachas and there are naturally principle halachas also, right? We can sort of start mixing the different things that we're discussing here.
Yeah, similar to her last.
Fight it out.
Okay. Yeah, similar to her last point, I was just going to say that you talk about the way you could take ethical issues and sort of change the discussion from macro to micro. I think it's important to note, just in general, in regards to your share here about understanding halacha, like naturally understanding halacha to be a legal discourse in the way that you relate it to like applying philosophy of law to halacha. I think it's important to note that to a certain extent, before like the proliferation of Svarim and like written code of halacha, it actually was more naturally maybe like a macro type system in which it wasn't necessarily exactly like a legal discourse in the way being discussed here, and that people sort of took those macro concepts and made them micro by writing Svarim and things like that.
So I would have put that. I would have phrased that as halacha became more rule focused and less principle focused.
Yeah.
But you can say it that way as well. Yeah. I'm sorry. I don't know if it was.
Sure. So just for the sake of making sure that this can translate easily into real life beyond the specific examples. Obviously, it can get kind of confusing and frustrating when you have people making micro arguments and then somebody else responds with a macro argument, and that can be frustrating. But I guess my question is there a place for a micro argument to speak to a macro argument in the legal world? Or should we expect to see, and is this really your ulterior motive for having this talk, that on God Save Us From Your Opinion, you'll see hashtag micro arguments only. or hashtag macro arguments only, and that's really what we're trying to dial in on the specific issue.
If that happens, I will very gladly bury my head in the internet sand and not surface ever again.
Is there a place for the two arguments to speak?
Yes, of course. The two arguments are doing very, very different things, and they're speaking to they're speaking in very different ways. So the examples I give on here, well, let's ignore the first example, which is fun, but in each of the three categories, I have two examples. One about riding scooters in parks, which is 5 minutes? Okay, which is fun and interesting, but not to talk about it. But the second one is Babylon Rabbis. It's more term is over. The discussions, the debates over this issue are taking place in all three of these types of argumentation. There are micro-arguments made about this. At the same time as the same exact people are also making macro arguments. At the same time that the same exact people are also making meta-arguments. And they're not always explicit about them. But it's important to realize what sort of argument is being made, because understanding the kind of argument that's being made allows us to sort of think about the persuasiveness and how we think that argument impacts the issue. By their nature, macro arguments, well, no, that's not true. Sort of the narrow technical micro-type arguments are often easily manipulable, especially in a complex system like ours. You can come up with almost any, arguably, right? I'm a lawyer. I can come up with pretty much any micro-argument for any position you want in the world, I think. For real. Right? Any halacha, right? right? The member of the Sanhedrin has to be able to be Matamish Sheretz. Okay, he has to be able to make a good argument that Sheratzim are Tahar. The Torah says they're not, but you can construct all sorts of really great micro-arguments why they should be in a particular case. And the only reason why those arguments fail is because there's something bigger at play. We would probably in this case call it a meta-argument or a rule of recognition that says no matter what your micro-argument here is, the rule of recognition says that your conclusion is wrong. It's not a valid rule. It's not a valid conclusion because the Torah says not. Yeah, sorry.
All right.
Thank you.
Given what you've been saying, you touched on this briefly at the start of things, and I think people have been edging around, and especially with the question about all the Sfarim edging things to a micro legal process. Do you feel that has there been a shift in halacha in general and in the approach on the ground to how people are treating halacha? Do you feel that this is in play in different denominations? And if so, do you think that people are consciously thinking about how the everyday decisions go back to a larger framework?
That's a lot of things. Yes, I think, well,
I just look at it.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the questions again so I can answer them in order?
Okay, I hope this is logically formulated, but basically if...
Sorry, just before we continue, I think we're going to hit up on our deadline, and I'm not going to get to finish, so everyone who wants to finish reading it and sort of see how it plugs into their ideas about how these conversations work, great, and I'm around and happy to talk, but yeah, sorry.
I can remember the song.
I'm sorry.
Basically, do you think that with the general proliferation of books that focus on the micro level, has this been shifting the macro level? Is this in play in any of the different denominations? And if so, if this is in play, has this shifted the macro level? Because the micro level isn't.
Yes.
And is anyone thinking about it?
No. No, I shouldn't say that. Not no. There are people who are thinking about it. Rabbi Jeremy Leader, for example, and all of the much publicized and or not really publicized that they took place, but not really publicized what they consist of, arguments or papers that he's written over the last couple of years about the SAR tefillin thing, and about women rabbis, and there was another one also. Partnership Minyanim. Partnership Minyanim. I tend to think, although I don't think he's trained in legal philosophy at all, I think he's very aware of the interplay of these different types of arguments that are being made, and is conscious of it. I tend to see that certain poskim or certain halachists floating around, especially in the hard, controversial issues where this kind of stuff really sort of plays out, right? No one cares whether your pot is kosher or not. You answer the question, whether white or not, it doesn't matter. Right? But in sort of the hard cases that are interesting and fun and that we all kill each other over.
Say reproductive issues. Like say, I don't know, reproductive issues.
Sure,
rights,
of course, yes, all of these good issues. I don't mean this sort of in sort of a nasty way, but these are like the good juicy issues. These are like, this is where stuff really like is interesting. Pots are boring. This is really interesting stuff. And no, it's interesting precisely because it's complicated. But there, I think you see that there are different halachists that are taking very different approaches to how they treat arguments. If I can say so, and they're not consistent, by the way, they're sort of political about it. But I would argue personally that I see many of the poskim that many would place in the unclear, very vague, open Orthodox umbrella on women's issues really love micro-arguments. They really, really love micro-arguments. Because they can get to unconventional conclusions with micro-arguments. Because when you deal with local questions and you're dealing with the sources can be interpreted almost any way you want. When you have to engage the broader questions, especially the meta questions, right? Questions about how the whole system is supposed to work in totality, not so much. It becomes harder to justify, I think. And they maybe don't engage those the same way, right? So Rabbi Sperber is speaking later today right at Columbia, and far be it from me to remotely even attempt to engage him in any of these topics because I'm completely inadequate to do so. But it seems to me that when he sort of discusses partnership minyanim, for example, what he's really doing is he's making perfectly plausible micro-argument that relies on both rules and principles, because there are rules and principles at play in his micro-argument, but really what he's doing is he's playing with the micro system without giving an adequate explanation of how this coheres within the broader functioning system of halacha as a system. That's my personal opinion. Now, I think that happens on the other side also, right? You have people who are completely unwilling to engage the micro-arguments because they're so focused on the meta-arguments, system, how does the system work? We have to make sure the system works the way it does. And that forces you, or doesn't force you, but it leads to a tendency to avoid the micro-questions because those are hard and those sort of start poking holes in your theory of how the bigger system functions. And so I think there are tendencies all those ways. Are we like done?
I mean, everyone's.
I don't want to keep talking.
You want to go downstairs, so
Why don't we
let's. I think people
I'm at least
have
half
to.
yucky, so I really like don't.
Right.
Be a cause for more.
There's an exciting creative art project made for everybody, so you can switch your mode of thinking and use your brain in a new way.
Mhm.
But I'm happy to talk to people on.